They called it an eyesore. They said it didn't fit the aesthetic of the neighborhood. So, without notice, without warning, they demolished the shed I had built with my own hands, on my own land. What they didn't know is that 2 weeks before they swung that first hammer, I was sworn in as the new mayor of this town. And when you mess with the mayor's property, well, let's just say, things escalate quickly. This is the story of how my local HOA tried to flex their authority and ended up answering to mine. I built the shed 2 summers ago. Nothing fancy, just a solid wooden structure at the back of my property, meant to store gardening tools, a few old bikes, and some outdoor furniture. I painted it a muted forest, green to blend in with the trees, added a shingled roof, and even planted some hedges around it. To me, it was practical, peaceful, part of the land. But to the HOA, it was apparently an architectural crime. It started small. A passive-aggressive letter slipped into my mailbox. Your outbuilding may not meet community aesthetic standards. Please refer to Article 4, Section C. No signature, no formal complaint, just a vague jab. I ignored it. I had bigger things on my plate at the time, literally running a mayoral campaign. Weeks passed, and the letters became more direct. They called it offensive to the visual harmony of the block. One letter even said it was a threat to neighborhood property values. A threat? It was a shed. Meanwhile, one of my neighbors had a lawn full of plastic flamingos and another had a rusty truck up on cinder blocks. But no, my painted shed was the apocalypse, apparently. I attended an HOA meeting just to see who was behind the crusade. That's when I met her, Madeline Crane. HOA president, early 60s, pearls always on, and a face that had permanently settled into a frown of superiority. She didn't even let me finish a sentence. If the shed isn't removed by the end of the month, she said, we will handle it ourselves. I chuckled. That was my first mistake. I thought it was all empty talk. I even joked with my wife that Madeline should run for city council with that much confidence. But I underestimated how far the HOA would go when they felt disrespected. These people didn't just want compliance, they wanted submission. Then came the surprise inspection. I was out of town at a conference when I got a text from my neighbor. Dude, there's a crew tearing down your shed. I thought it was a prank. I called home. No answer. I called again. Still nothing. I pulled up the security cam app on my phone and watched, stunned, as a crew with HOA badges dismantled the shed piece by piece. They hadn't even notified me. No letter, no final warning, no legal process. They just marched onto my land and demolished my property like it was theirs. I remember staring at my phone screen in disbelief as one of them kicked over a box of tools and laughed. When I returned 2 days later, the shed was gone. In its place, a yellow HOA sign had been staked. Into the dirt, area cleared for community aesthetic restoration. My blood boiled. My wife was furious, my kids were confused. And Madeline, she had the nerve to send a follow-up letter thanking me for voluntarily cooperating. But what the HOA didn't know, what made this entire situation deliciously poetic, was that just 2 weeks before they touched a single nail, I had been elected mayor. The paperwork hadn't gone public yet, but the appointment was official. The swearing in was quiet, private, just close friends, family, and the city council. And now, I had something far more powerful than a shed. I had authority, real authority. And I was about to teach the HOA a very public lesson about property rights and consequences. I didn't react right away. I didn't storm into the next HOA meeting. I didn't yell. That's not how mayors handle things. Instead, I got to work. The very next morning, I walked into City Hall, sat at my new office desk, and called a meeting with the city zoning department. They were surprised to see me moving so quickly, but I wasn't wasting any time. My shed may have been small, but the precedent they set was massive, and I wasn't about to let that slide. Pull every permit that HOA has filed in the last 2 years, I said. I want to know what they've built, where, and how they did it. An hour later, I had a stack of inconsistencies taller than the HOA president's hair. Unpermitted fences, illegal tree removals, even a playground they built that was never cleared by the city. The irony was thick. They were violating more codes than half the homeowners they fined. And now, I had receipts. I wasn't done. I scheduled a meeting with the city attorney. We reviewed property rights, municipal authority, and the HOA's standing. Turns out, their demolition of my shed had crossed multiple legal lines: trespassing, destruction of private property, abuse of power, and failure to follow due process. The kind of stuff that would get a private citizen sued, or worse. But I didn't want a lawsuit. I wanted a message. So I did what any strategic public official would do. I ordered a full municipal audit of the HOA. Every financial record, every transaction, every email, all under the pretense of a routine compliance review. Except this review had teeth, and it bit hard. Within a week, HOA members were receiving formal letters from the city, requests for documentation, summons to appear, notices of zoning violations. The same people who had strutted around the neighborhood with clipboards and smug smiles were now sweating through board meetings and calling emergency sessions behind closed doors. And the best part? They still didn't know I was the one behind. Yet I played the long game. I showed up to a city council meeting as mayor, my first public appearance in office. Madeline was in the crowd. I saw the moment her face dropped. Her eyes widened, lips parted slightly, clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield. She leaned over to whisper to someone, probably to confirm that, yes, the same man whose shed she ordered destroyed was now standing at the podium as her mayor. I addressed the room professionally. This administration believes in fair governance and community unity, I said. No group or association, no matter how long established, is above the law. I didn't have to name the HOA. Everyone already knew. The room buzzed. Madeline shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The power dynamics had flipped, and I was just getting started. That weekend, I walked past the empty spot where my shed had been. I took a deep breath. The anger was still there, sure, but now it was focused, controlled. Behind me, my wife asked, "What are you planning?" I smiled. "Restoration," I said, with interest. And so I called the city planner and submitted blueprints, not for a new shed, but for a multi-purpose community storage facility, right in the same spot, fully compliant, fully funded. And with my signature as mayor at the bottom of the approval document. Oh, and one more thing. I named it the Crane Center, after Madeline, a little tribute, so she'd never forget the shed that started it all. By the second week of the audit, things were unraveling faster than I expected. At first, the HOA board tried to downplay it, telling residents it was just a routine city checkup and nothing to worry about. But the volume of requests coming in from different city departments told a different story. They were buried in paperwork, legal questions, and mandatory disclosures they couldn't delay or dodge. And when the city's compliance officer flagged the first discrepancy, the dominoes started falling. Turns out, the HOA treasurer had been reimbursing herself for miscellaneous expenses that totaled over $14,000. When asked for receipts, she submitted handwritten notes and vague Excel spreadsheets. One of them literally said, "board snacks." Another line item was, "decorative compliance supplies," whatever that meant. The city's financial oversight team flagged it as misappropriation of community funds. Meanwhile, the zoning violations piled up. That community playground they were so proud of, built 3 feet too close to the road, without safety railings, and directly over a water line. The retaining wall behind the clubhouse? Not only unpermitted, but it was also built by a company owned by the HOA president's nephew. No bids, no contracts, just shady backdoor deals. This wasn't just HOA. Overreach. It was corruption. I didn't need to lift a finger publicly. The system did the work for me. All I had to do was follow up, approve the motions, and make sure every city department had what they needed. The pressure intensified. Madeline stopped attending public events. Rumors swirled that she was holding emergency meetings at her house, trying to rally what little support she had left. But it was useless. The evidence was overwhelming, and I had made sure it was moving fast. Residents began to notice. People who once rolled their eyes at HOA fines started asking questions. Why are my fees so high? Who approved these renovations? Where's our annual financial report? The same HOA board that demanded transparency and control from everyone else was now on the receiving end, and they had nothing to show. One particularly bold neighbor, Mr. Callahan, retired military, stood up during an open community meeting and said, "I want to know why my dues are funding someone's personal landscaping." He held up a printout from the audit showing HOA funds being used to hire a luxury gardening service. The room exploded, voices raised, a crowd gathered. The board tried to adjourn the meeting early, but it was too late. The floodgates had opened. The city attorney began preparing a formal investigation into potential fraud. I reviewed the request, signed it, and forwarded it to the oversight committee. Every step was legal. Every step was justified. But behind closed doors, I can admit it, felt personal. They came for me over a shed. Now they were watching their own house collapse, plank by plank. Madeline finally broke her silence with a letter to all residents. It was 2 pages of deflection, vague apologies, and finger-pointing. She blamed administrative misunderstandings and communication issues with the city. Not once did she take responsibility. Not once did she mention my name. But she didn't have to. Everyone knew what was happening. Everyone knew who had turned on the lights. The HOA board was given 10 business days to produce all financial records from the past 5 years. When they failed to comply, the city issued fines, not suggestions, not warnings, actual daily fines. For once, they were the ones being ticketed, monitored, and pressured, and they had no idea how to handle it. Behind the scenes, I received dozens of messages from grateful residents, people I didn't even know thanking me for standing up. A few even admitted they were once afraid of the HOA, afraid of being fined, shamed, or ostracized. Now they felt empowered, united. And I knew then, this was bigger than just revenge. This was reform. The next HOA meeting was packed. Normally, only a handful of people showed up, mostly the same faces nodding along with Madeline's every word. But this time, the room was full. Standing room only. People brought printed copies of audit findings. Others brought questions, real, pointed questions. And for the first time in years, the board didn't have rehearsed answers or confident smirks. They looked trapped, because they were. I didn't attend that meeting as mayor. I didn't have, and I sat quietly in the back, as just another resident, arms crossed. The murmurs when I walked in told me everything I needed to know. People had figured it out. The timing, the investigation, the sudden wave of accountability. It all pointed back to me. And while a few board loyalists shot me cold stares, the majority nodded as I passed, some whispering thanks. The shift had begun. Madeline took the podium, looking pale and visibly rattled. Her opening line was, "We've all made mistakes." The room didn't respond. No one clapped. No one nodded. She continued, trying to regain control, but it was like watching a dethroned queen pleading for her crown. Every sentence was met with silence or sideways glances. The illusion of authority had shattered. Then came the residents. One by one, they stood and spoke. "Why did you fine me $500 for a lawn chair, but spend thousands on catered HOA parties? Who authorized the playground project with no safety inspection? Why were you allowed to destroy private property without legal recourse?" The board stumbled through non-answers, deflections, and shallow apologies. The crowd wasn't buying it. Midway through the meeting, Mr. Callahan, our unofficial neighborhood voice of reason, stood up again. He held a copy of the HOA bylaws. According to Section 9A, we can vote to dissolve the current board if a quorum of homeowners agree. I think it's time. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in support. People nodded. Hands went up. Some stood and applauded. The motion was real. And now, it was in motion. The vote didn't happen that night, but the idea had been planted, and it spread like wildfire. Over the next few days, residents began organizing. Petitions were signed. Door-to-door conversations turned into group chats. A neighborhood Facebook group that once only posted garage sales and dog sightings became a rallying point for change. The energy was contagious and irreversible. At City Hall, I received a formal notice from the HOA attorney requesting a private mediation to rebuild mutual respect between leadership and municipal officials. Translation: they wanted to cut a backdoor deal before they were voted out completely. I declined, politely. I told them any future negotiation would be public, transparent, and documented. No more secrets, no more handshakes in the dark. Within 2 weeks, the required number of signatures was met. A special election was scheduled to replace the entire HOA board. Madeline and her inner circle tried to stall it legally, but the bylaws they once weaponized were now working against them. The vote was official and irreversible. On the night of the election, I didn't campaign, I didn't endorse, I didn't need to. The community spoke louder than any slogan or speech could. Every board member was voted out. Every single one. The new board? A mix of teachers, veterans, parents, and small business owners. People who actually lived in the neighborhood. People who had once been fined, silenced, or ignored. That night, standing on my porch as neighbors passed by with high fives and cheers, I realized something bigger had happened. This wasn't just revenge for a demolished shed. This was a reclamation of power. Not by me, but by the people. And I knew then, the HOA would never hold this neighborhood hostage again. The days that followed the election felt different. The air was lighter. Conversations on the street shifted from complaints and quiet resentment to collaboration and ideas. People began speaking openly again, smiling more, inviting each other for coffee instead of whispering about fines and rules. The neighborhood, for the first time in years, actually felt like a community and not a tightly wound collection of people just trying to stay out of trouble. The newly elected board wasted no time. Their first move was transparency. Every financial document was published online. Monthly meetings were live-streamed and recorded. Residents could submit questions anonymously or speak freely in person. The fear that once clung to every gathering was gone, replaced by something rare in HOA neighborhoods: trust. I offered support when asked, but I didn't interfere. I wasn't interested in replacing tyranny with influence. My goal had never been to control the HOA. It was to free the people from it. I attended meetings just like everyone else, submitted a few recommendations, and helped connect the board with the city departments they'd previously feared. It was cooperation now, not confrontation. One of the first items on the new board's agenda was addressing the damages done, literally and metaphorically. Refunds were issued to those who had been excessively fined under the old regime. Public apologies were made. And then came the symbolic gesture, the approval to rebuild on the site where my shed once stood. Only this time, it wasn't a shed. The board, in a unanimous vote, proposed a small community library and tool shed, a space where residents could share resources, gardening tools, books, even outdoor equipment. They named it the Green Shed, in homage to the one that started it all. They asked if I'd like to cut the ribbon at the grand opening. I accepted, humbly. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. Neighbors gathered, kids ran around, and someone even brought cupcakes decorated with little wooden sheds on top. I stood beside the new board president, A young woman who'd once been fined for painting her door the wrong shade of red, and together we cut the ribbon. The crowd clapped. I looked around and saw Madeline nowhere in sight. Her era was over. This was something new. But the transformation wasn't just physical. People started volunteering more. Gardening projects cropped up in shared spaces. A neighborhood watch was formed, not out of fear, but care. Families that had barely spoken before were now planning block parties and movie nights. It was like the whole neighborhood had exhaled after years of holding its breath. Even city departments noticed the change. Reports of complaints dropped. Requests for permits increased, but now they were submitted properly and with community input. It was efficient, respectful, cooperative. The very systems that had once been weaponized were now functioning the way they were meant to, as tools of support, not suppression. One evening, as I walked past the new community space where my shed once stood, I paused. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light across the lawn. Kids were laughing, neighbors chatting nearby, and the scent of fresh grass hung in the air. My wife joined me, handing me a cup of coffee. "Do you regret not retaliating harder?" she asked. I shook my head. No, I didn't want revenge. I wanted change, and look at this place. She nodded, resting her head on my shoulder. "It's beautiful," she said. Weeks passed. The tension that once haunted our neighborhood had dissolved completely. But for me, something still lingered. Not bitterness, not anger, but a sense of responsibility. I had seen firsthand what unchecked power could do to a community, and I knew that if it happened here, it could happen anywhere. I didn't want to just rebuild my shed or help my neighborhood. I wanted to send a message, one that echoed far beyond our block. So I decided to write a formal report, not as mayor, not as a victim, but as a citizen. A full breakdown of how the HOA had abused power, how it was dealt with legally, and how the community restructured itself from the inside out. I titled it, "How to Deconstruct a Broken HOA, a Citizen's Guide to Taking Back Your Community." It wasn't about revenge. It was about empowerment. We published it on the city website, and it went viral within a week. Other neighborhoods started reaching out, asking for advice, requesting meetings, wanting to replicate what we had done. It was surreal. One moment I was just a guy trying to protect a little shed behind his house. Now I was speaking at forums about community reform, zoning transparency, and local leadership. The irony wasn't lost on me. The HOA destroyed my shed because they thought it was ugly. In the end, their act of petty control turned into the catalyst for a citywide movement. Their attempt to silence and shame had only amplified the need for change. And the best part? It was all done by the book. Every step, every paper filed, every motion passed. That was the part that drove them mad. Madeline eventually moved out, quietly. No farewell message, no final statement, just a moving truck and a cold goodbye. I don't hate her. I never did. I think she was a product of a system that rewarded control over connection. But systems can be redesigned. And when they are, the people who rely on fear to lead usually vanish, because they never knew how to lead in the first place. As the months went by, I began to get recognized, not as the mayor, but as the shed guy. People would laugh, shake my hand, and say things like, "You're the reason our HOA finally chilled out." I didn't mind. The title of mayor will pass. But that legacy? That one mattered. And the green shed. It became more than a symbol. It became a hub. People left books, seeds, tools. Kids would paint rocks and hide them around it for others to find. It was no longer mine. It was ours. The very thing they tried to erase had become the most unifying part of the neighborhood. It was poetic justice, carved in wood and community spirit. One night, I received a letter, no return address. Inside was a single sentence handwritten in sharp, looping cursive. "You were never supposed to win. No signature. But I didn't need one." I smiled, folded the note, and placed it in my desk drawer. Maybe it was meant to rattle me. Maybe it was one last gasp from a fading voice. But all I could think was, that's where you were wrong. Because I didn't just win. We all did.